and welcome to Season 9 of the Equip Project podcast. Jim, it's great to be back, isn't it? It's been almost 5 months, I believe, or at least 5 months since we last sat around this table. I think it was back in December.
Yes, indeed, Ollie. The fault is entirely mine. I feel consumed with guilt. I've been really busy with a little side project for the past few months, and I'm afraid that the podcast got bumped for far too long. So I have to repent in metaphorical sackcloth and ashes to our listeners. I am very sorry. So anyway, while I genuflect before this microphone, you can tell everyone what you've been up to.
Well, our listeners are very gracious, Jim, so I'm sure that they will forgive you. Don't feel too guilty. But no, I haven't. I've been keeping busy. I haven't done anything too exciting. Probably the most exciting thing I did was I was away on holiday in northern Italy last week.
Oh, lovely.
Which was wonderful. So I escaped Northern Irish spring and actually got a little bit of sunshine. So that was a great blessing.
Saw the Alps?
Saw the Alps, yeah, which was extremely exciting. Snow-capped Alps.
That's where Hannibal came with his elephants.
Oh, man, I wish I'd remembered that while I was there, because I could have sort of, I would have enjoyed it.
The most astonishing piece of military strategy.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't call that to mind. Next time I will. But I'm back and I'm feeling refreshed and revitalized and excited for what the rest of this year holds in terms of the Equip podcast. I think we've got a lot of exciting episodes coming up in this season. And I'm also excited, Jim, because it's an extremely interesting summer of sport. We've got the Olympics, we've got the football, the Euros, and we also have...
Well done, Wales.
Well done, Wales.
Rishi Sunak said.
As Rishi said. We've got 2 elections. So for political people who love their politics, this is a very exciting year. But Jim, before we get into it, let's just think a little bit about what we're going to be discussing this season. We're going to be thinking about world religions and cults. So we're going to have episodes on Hinduism this episode, then Buddhism and Islam, and we'll also deal with the Jehovah's Witness movement and Mormonism. And I guess the first question that springs to mind here is why should we bother thinking about all these other religions?
Well, it would be downright irresponsible not to consider what billions of other human beings believe. I mean, how can we really know that Christianity is true if we haven't considered alternative answers? I find it helpful to think about it in this way. You know, there are really only about 7 different belief systems that anyone can adopt. I'm thinking here about categories like atheism, agnosticism, polytheism, pantheism, theism, and so on. Now, here's the thing. You have to believe something. No one can escape from that choice. You have to adopt one of the 7 basic worldviews that underpin every belief system that has ever been proposed in history by anyone. So for the Christian, one of the best antidotes to doubt is to become convinced that Christianity tells a better story than the alternatives. So the first thing I'm going to say is that considering world religions is an antidote to doubt.
Okay, I really like that, and hopefully that helps our listeners understand why we're going to consider this topic. It's also helpful to remember that we now live in a globalized village. So in the UK and in Northern Ireland, the world has effectively come to our doorstep through immigration. So it's likely we work alongside Hindus and Buddhists and people who believe in religions like Islam. And that means in order to be effective in evangelism, it's really important that we're able to understand and respond to other belief systems.
Now, that's all very true, Ollie, but there is another reason why we're engaging in this topic, but I am not going to reveal it just yet.
Oh, wow. That does sound very, very mysterious, almost like Rishi refusing to tell us when the election was going to be. Jim, can you give us any hint of when you're going to reveal this mystery?
In episode 3.
Okay.
I intend to make a prophecy.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's probably a first for the Equip Project podcast, to be honest, Jim. Not what I'm used to. Can you tell us any more, or is that all you're going to give us?
Well, I might have just made an overstatement. It might be better to say that in episode 3, I will make a tentative prediction.
Okay.
So once we've thought about the religions of the East, what I'm going to do is suggest a theory about how they might impact us here in the West. I mean, to be serious, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet. But I really think that these world religions are going to become really important to us in the years ahead. So on that mysterious note, we will move on. So for now, we'll just leave this thesis as a vague warning that our conversations aren't just for academic interest.
Okay, well, I'll make a prophecy then, Jim. I reckon our listenership is going to spike enormously when it comes to episode 3, given that mystery. So I'm excited to see the stats for that. But in this opening conversation, we're going to think about Hinduism. At the moment, Christians make up about 32% of the world population. Muslims account for 23%, and Hindus make up for 15% of the world population. So Hinduism it's a vast, complex belief system, and I'm sure many of our listeners will know it's centered in India. But to begin with, Jim, just as an opening question, how should we approach Hinduism?
Well, Christians invariably hit a stumbling block whenever they approach the religions of the East. We assume that they are the same kind of thing as Christianity. So let's just consider the Christian faith for a moment. It is, as you know, divided into 3 great factions. In the year 1054, the Great Schism occurred when the Greek Church split from the Latin Church, and that gave rise to the Orthodox Church. Then 500 years later, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints Church in Wittenberg, and that led to the division between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So when you view it as a global movement, Christianity is divided into 3 big blocks: Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Protestant. Now, I don't want to minimize the differences between those groupings, but they are all recognizable as Christian. All 3 believe in one creator, a creator God who is tri-personal. Within the one being, there are 3 persons known as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All 3 groupings affirm that Jesus Christ is fully God and fully man. They affirm his sacrificial death on the cross, his physical resurrection. They are united in the belief that Christ will return to judge the world. All 3 groups affirm the 66 books in your Bible as the inspired Word of God. They even share creeds. I mean, think of the Nicene Creed of 381 AD or the Chalcedonian Creed of 451. These creeds define the heart of Orthodox Christian belief. Okay? So, given that background, let's imagine a Christian beginning a dialogue with a Hindu. Okay, he says, tell me what you believe. Show me your creedal statements, and then I will tell you what my creeds say, and we can have a courteous, rational debate about which one is true and which one is false. As we'll see in episode 4, that approach might work with Islam, because both Islam and Christianity have theological structure, clearly defined, angular contours. So Islamic and Christian apologists contest the coherence and truthfulness of the other's belief system. But try that with a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Taoist, and you will stumble at the first fence. The first point to make about Hinduism is that there is no such thing as Hinduism.
Okay, a somewhat surprising first point, but I think I get what you're saying. It's actually that this idea or this term Hinduism is a catch-all term for a collection of religions that sometimes feed off each other and sometimes even contradict each other.
Yes, in a minute or two, I want to think about the 2 main systems within Hinduism. But first, let's consider a couple of concepts that are shared by all the religious branches in the Hindu tree. Okay, and the 2 concepts are called samsara and moksha. Samsara is the endless cycle of lives brought about by reincarnation and karma. You'll be familiar with the Eastern idea of reincarnation. Each of us lives an almost endless sequence of lives, apparently, sometimes as humans, even sometimes as animals. And it is karma which determines the type of being that reincarnation will produce next time round. Now, it's really important to realize, in Hindu thought, karma is not a god. It's best understood as a big cosmic moral equation that measures all the good and bad things that we have done in this life.
We get a hint of karmic thought in John's Gospel in the Bible in chapter 9, where a man born blind is introduced to Jesus. And the Lord's disciples ask him, they say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" That question is rooted in the idea that suffering is a form of atonement for sins committed prior to this man's birth.
Yeah. It's interesting that Jesus dismisses that theory with a single word, neither, he says. The man's blindness wasn't caused either by his sin or by his parents' sin. I just want to think a little bit about the philosophical problems that arise with these doctrines of karma and reincarnation. As a general point, whenever you're evaluating a worldview, and I'm including the Christian worldview here, it's important to make sure that it is coherent. If a belief system contains contradictory propositions, or if it refutes itself, then it cannot be true. A foundational test for the truth of a worldview must evaluate its coherence, or if you like, its logical consistency. That's because truth will always be wholly consistent within itself. It always displays internal logical harmony. So the coherence test stresses the crucial unity and relatedness of all truth, and that's what we're going to do.
Okay, so we're going to apply the coherence test to this doctrine of samsara, the cycle of rebirths. And the cycle has 4 stages, if you like: birth, karmic debt, death, and rebirth.
Okay, let's take an example. Suppose Reinhard Heydrich, he was a Nazi mastermind behind the Holocaust. Suppose he was reincarnated following his death in 1942. Heydrich was responsible for great evil in his previous life, but in his new life he would have no knowledge or memory of what he did before, and his old evil dispositions would be gone.
And that's because personal identity is not maintained as samsara cycle progresses.
That's right. So having a fresh start, so to speak, wouldn't Heydrich be a brand new person? If so, why punish the new person for what the old one did? You can go further. Because Heydrich would have no memory of his past deeds or of genocide against the Jews, how would he know that he was being justly punished and that he needed to change his ways in order to avoid building up negative karmic debt in the future? How could reincarnation change a person who's oblivious to his past actions?
George Harrison was a member of the Beatles, and he was an advocate of Eastern mysticism, and he once said that he was destined to become a member of the Beatles because of something he did in a previous life. But ultimately, Harrison was the victim of a crazed fan who broke into his home in England and stabbed him numerous times with a knife. Would Harrison also have said that the violent crime committed against him happened because of something evil he did in a previous lifetime?
Yeah, it's a good illustration. If karma is real, then one reason people become victims of violent crimes is that they did something horrific in a previous life. But how could any justice system be built on moral reasoning like that? An obvious example of the confusion here can be seen by any visitor to cities like Mumbai or Bangalore. I mean, think of the impoverished children living in the slums of those cities. Are they suffering because of their past life injustices? If these children are reaping justice for their previous evil actions, then why would anyone want to help them? Why give them food and shelter and clothing if such acts interfere with the just punishment they so rightly deserve? Just as people wouldn't help a criminal escape justice, they shouldn't help guilty children who obviously committed evil in their past lives and need to work out their karma.
Viewing the doctrine of samsara in the light of real life in India is important, because most Westerners who are favorable towards reincarnation tend to view it in an optimistic light. They see it as a second chance to improve a person's lot in life. But for Indian people who are assigned to the lower levels of India's caste system, there's a feeling of being trapped in this endless cycle. For them, samsara is a pessimistic concept that is oppressive and which breeds fatalism.
That's right. I mean, I have seen that problem firsthand in India. I mean, it is indisputable that members of India's lower echelon are consistently marginalized in a society. They suffer stigma and discrimination. They feel trapped in a religious determinism beyond their ability to change. And the practical fruit of reincarnation has proven sour in those parts of the world that take this philosophical idea seriously.
Because in practice, samsara is such a source of pessimism, Hindus long for the second concept you mentioned, this thing called moksha. What is that, and how does it actually work?
Sounds a bit like a coffee.
I thought that. It's actually made me kind of crave a coffee, actually.
At the end of the endless cycle of reincarnation, you get a coffee. No, moksha really means liberation, right? It represents this breaking of the iron law of birth, karmic debt, death, rebirth enforced by karma. So moksha is the moment when someone escapes that endless wheel of existence. So all the Hindu religions are designed to help us escape samsara and find moksha. All the systems are meant to break the endless cycle of reincarnation controlled by karma and enter into some form of liberated eternity.
Okay, so let's now think about how the various systems in Hinduism achieve moksha. There are 4 main systems within Hinduism, and they are described as the 4 paths. There's the way of knowledge, the way of devotion, the way of works, and the way of meditation. What are we to make of these four paths?
I was trying to think how to describe these four paths, and I came up with this analogy. Imagine a collection of travel brochures. One describes in gushing prose the beauty of a cruise through Norwegian fjords, another the thrill of a hot air balloon ride over a South African game reserve. A third offers the delights of a week in bustling New York. The fourth promotes the relaxing beaches of the Maldives. Now, that might seem like an attractive way to describe a religion, but it glosses over the simple fact that Norway, South Africa, New York, and the Maldives are completely different destinations.
We can illustrate that problem by thinking about the first two paths then, the way of knowledge and the way of devotion. The best known version of the way of knowledge is called Advaita Vedanta. What does it teach?
Advaita Vedanta teaches that we escape the endless cycle of birth and rebirth, this thing called samsara, by gaining knowledge about the true nature of reality. The truth, we're told, is that there is only one thing. So all dualisms, the distinctions we make between things, those are just illusions. In the ultimate sense, there is only one thing, and that thing is called Brahman, which is the impersonal essence of the cosmos. It's sometimes called the absolute impersonal. Now, according to the way of knowledge, only eyes that have been spiritually opened can discern this one absolute reality. So if I'm being honest just now, I can sense this table and the microphone in front of me. I'm also aware of my own body, and I make a distinction between those things. My body changes as I wave my hands, while the table undergoes much less change. But if I followed the way of knowledge, then it is claimed that eventually I would see that the table and I share the same unchanging inner reality. And that inner oneness is more real than the concepts of Jim and the table. Okay? Now, you find this concept of things being ever more real quite a lot in Hinduism. Reality has different levels, and the way of knowledge is designed to raise us to the highest level of reality, to Brahman, the absolute impersonal.
Okay. I have to confess, I find that quite hard to get my head around, Jim.
It is quite hard, yeah. Some Hindu philosophers give an illustration, which I think is helpful. The illustration is of a raindrop falling into the ocean. As it falls, the raindrop is an individual thing with a specific shape and density and speed. But when it is absorbed into the ocean, it loses its individuality. So does the raindrop still exist? Well, yes and no. The molecules that made up the raindrop are in the ocean, but the individual drop does not. Now, think what that means if you apply that analogy to you and me. If we are to escape the endless cycle of birth and rebirth, then moksha means the complete loss of personal identity. In eternity, there will be no I-thou relations, no you and me. There is just the one ocean of impersonal bliss. The big problem humans have, according to this system, is that we confuse the finite world with its messy distinctions with the ultimately real world of the one.
So that's the way of knowledge. Let's contrast that way with the second approach known as the way of devotion. This path is commonly called Bhakti Hinduism.
Bhakti Hinduism is really interesting. It is completely different from the way of knowledge that we've just been discussing. Okay. Now, I probably should have said earlier that a lot of popular temple Hinduism is actually really polytheistic. Lots and lots of different gods are shown devotion. But Bhakti Hinduism is all about showing devotion to a personal creator god, often called Vishnu. In Christian language, Vishnu has been incarnated into the world 7 times. His most famous and popular incarnation, Hindus call it an avatar, was in the form of Krishna. Okay, so Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu. So in this way of devotion, the Bhakti Hinduism, Hindus worship Krishna as an incarnation of Vishnu. Now, that makes our eyebrows shoot up because it sounds rather like Christian theology, doesn't it? Well, in fact, the parallels run even deeper. In some schools of Bhakti Hinduism, we escape the endless cycle of samsara by grace. In an act of divine grace, Krishna can release us from samsara. It's maybe not terribly surprising that Bhakti Hinduism flourished after Hindus made contact with Christianity. But in truth, however, the links between Christianity and Bhakti Hinduism are fairly superficial. Yes, there is one personal creator God called Vishnu, but there are many ways to God. Bhakti Hindus are horrified at the exclusive claim of Christ when he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me." In practical terms, Vishnu can be represented by a guru or an idol. So it's quite acceptable for Hindu priests to worship their guru as God. The Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, or OCA for short, has a set of videos and is produced by a Hindu who converted to Christianity. And in his testimony, he quite openly admits that as a Hindu monk, he worshipped his guru as God.
Let's set these two strands of Hinduism side by side, the way of knowledge and the way of devotion. I think I now understand your earlier illustration of the travel brochures. If the way of knowledge takes us to the fjords of Norway, the way of devotion takes us to the beaches of the Maldives. The way of knowledge says that ultimate reality is impersonal, all is one and one is all. But the way of devotion leads us to a personal God that we can worship. So how can both be true?
Defenders of Hinduism, in my mind, just use rhetorical flourishes to sidestep that logic problem. There's a famous apologist called Hudson Smith, and he says, "Logic itself may melt in the full blaze of divine incandescence." The problem with this idea is that the whole thing refutes itself. I mean, the Hindu is claiming that his conception of God cannot be conceived, which seems like saying that a drawing cannot be drawn.
A lot of this material can seem very theoretical, but it has a practical effect on societies. So the caste system in India is a direct result of religious ideas. To be reincarnated as Dalit is shameful. To be reincarnated as Brahmin is just a step away from achieving moksha. You saw this up close, didn't you, Jim, when you were in India with work?
Yeah, in the days when I had a real job, I worked in the IT industry, and my job occasionally took me to India, to the great cities of Mumbai and Bangalore and Chennai. And on one trip, I spent a week in Chennai. It so happened that my wife and I sponsored a couple of girls who lived in a Christian orphanage in one of the city's slums. So I asked my hosts if I could take a couple of hours to go and visit the orphanage. It was a terrible place, I'll just tell you as an aside. When I was there, the lady in charge had a project and was raising funds for air conditioning. And she said, "It's not a luxury, Jim," she says. "If we open the windows, rats the size of cats will come in and bite the girls." Yeah.
Horrendous.
Unbelievable. Horrendous. So I asked my hosts anyway if I could take a couple of hours to go and visit this orphanage. And they stared at me in bemusement before politely agreeing to arrange for me to take a visit. It was actually hilarious. A young executive was assigned to accompany me, and I found out later he was a member of the Brahmin caste, okay? But my hosts were clearly worried about taking me to this terrible slum because I was escorted by two large SUVs the whole way. I mean, I felt like the president or something. Anyway, when I arrived, the youngest group of girls were seated on the floor, and they were dressed in pristine white frocks. And I had a camera with me, and so the girls began to crowd around and asking for their picture to be taken. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw that this young executive was becoming increasingly anxious and upset, and he winced when the little girls patted his knee. And eventually he gave a sort of strangled cry and ran out to the car and locked himself in it. And it suddenly struck me that the girls were all from the Dalit caste. For that young man, those little girls were literally untouchable.
Now, of course, many Hindus today work hard to destroy the caste system in their country, and we can acknowledge that with gratitude. But I'm so grateful that Christianity values all human beings. Every one of the girls in that orphanage bore the Imago Dei. They were creatures made in the image of God.
Yes. Now, the slums of India raise another difficult question for Hinduism. Many reasons have been given for that ghastly state of affairs. Post-colonialism has been blamed, obviously, or industrialization. But many scholars believe that there is a deeper reason. You see, Christianity produced within Western culture this idea that history is like an arrow. History is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So history itself has meaning. It is that view of history which produced the desire in the West for social justice. If you think about it, even Marxism is just a secular counterfeit of the Christian story. The social justice warriors of the progressive left are unwittingly following in the footsteps of William Wilberforce and the great Christian social reformers because they all share the idea that history is meaningful. Now, contrast that view of history with the worldview that we find in the East. Time in the East is not an arrow, it's an endless wheel. And our aim is to escape from the endless cycle of samsara and karma. Moksha is that form of enlightenment that allows an individual to apprehend the absolute impersonal. Now, a belief system like that is never going to be interested in social reform. So I respectfully suggest that defenders of Hinduism need to walk through the slums of Mumbai and ask themselves how their religion drives social justice. Of course, there are some strands within Hindu thought which do exactly that, of course, but it seems to me they do sit in the background.
Jim, it's been a really interesting discussion and hopefully has been a blessing and help to our listeners. Next week, we're going to be looking at Buddhism. So we look forward to that conversation. But until then, we hope you have a very good week. And Jim, really good to see you again. Great to be back together.
Great to be back. And remember, in week 3, we'll do a little bit on Taoism, and then I will give my prophecy.